Chapter 5 The King's Musketeers and the Cardinal's Guards. D'Artagnan was acquainted with nobody in Paris. He went therefore to his appointment with Athos without a second, determined to be satisfied with those his adversary should choose. Besides, his intention was formed to make the brave Musketeer all suitable apologies, but without meanness or weakness, fearing that might result from this duel, which generally results from an affair of this kind, when a young and vigorous man fights with an adversary who is wounded and weakened. If conquered, he doubles the triumph of his antagonist. If a conqueror, he is accused of foul play and one of courage. Now, we must have badly painted the character of our adventure seeker, or our readers must have already perceived that D'Artagnan was not an ordinary man. Therefore, while repeating to himself that his death was inevitable, he did not make up his mind to die quietly, as one less courageous and less restrained might have done in his place. He reflected upon the different characters of those with whom he was going to fight, and began to view his situation more clearly. He hoped, by means of loyal excuses, to make a friend of Athos, whose lordly air and austere bearing pleased him much. He flattered himself he should be able to frighten Porthos with the adventure of the baldric, which he might, if not killed upon the spot, relate to everybody a recital which, well managed, would cover Porthos with ridicule. As to the astute Aramis, he did not entertain much dread of him, and supposing he should be able to get so far, he determined to dispatch him in good style, or at least by hitting him in the face, as Caesar recommended his soldiers do to those of Pompey, to damage forever the beauty of which he was so proud. In addition to this, D'Artagnan possessed that invincible stock of resolution which the counsels of his father had implanted in his heart. Endure nothing from anyone but the king, the cardinal, and Monsieur de Tréville. He flew then, rather than walked, toward the convent of the Carme des Chasses, or rather Deschaux, as it was called at that period, a sort of building without a window, surrounded by barren fields, an accessory to the Peru clerks, and which was generally employed as the place for the duels of men who had no time to lose. When D'Artagnan arrived in sight of the bare spot of ground which extended along the foot of the monastery, Athos had been waiting about 5 minutes, and 12 o'clock was striking. He was, then, as punctual as the Samaritan woman, and the most rigorous casuist with regard to duels could have nothing to say. Athos, who still suffered grievously from his wound, though it had been dressed anew by Monsieur de Tréville's surgeon, was seated on a post, and waiting for his adversary with hat in hand, his feather even touching the ground. "Monsieur," said Athos, "I have engaged 2 of my friends as seconds, but these 2 friends are not yet come, at which I am astonished, as it is not at all their custom." "I have no seconds on my part, monsieur," said D'Artagnan, "for having only arrived yesterday in Paris, I as yet know no one but Monsieur de Tréville, to whom I was recommended by my father, who has the honor to be, in some degree, one of his friends." Athos reflected for an instant. "You know no one but Monsieur de Tréville?" he asked. "Yes, monsieur, I know only him." "Well, but then," continued Athos, speaking half to himself, "if I kill you, I shall have the air of a boy-slayer." "Not too much so," replied D'Artagnan, with a bow that was not deficient in dignity, "since you do me the honor to draw a sword with me while suffering from a wound which is very inconvenient." "Very inconvenient, upon my word. And you hurt me devilishly, I can tell you. But I will take the left hand. It is my custom in such circumstances. Do not fancy that I do you a favor. I use either hand easily. Wow, Princess Bride ripoff. And it will be even a disadvantage to you. A left-handed man is very troublesome to people who are not prepared for it. I regret I did not inform you sooner of this circumstance." "You have truly, monsieur," said D'Artagnan, bowing again, "a courtesy for which, I assure you, I am very grateful." "You confused me," replied Athos with his gentlemanly air. "Let us talk of something else, if you please. Ah, s'blood, how you have hurt me! My shoulder quite burns." "If you would permit me," said D'Artagnan, with timidity. "What, monsieur?" "I have a miraculous balsam for wounds, a balsam given to me by my mother, and of which I have made a trial upon myself." "Well?" "Well, I am sure that in less than 3 days this balsam would cure you, and at the end of 3 days, when you would be cured, well, sir, it would still do me a great honor to be your man. D'Artagnan spoke these words with a simplicity that did honor to his courtesy, without throwing the least doubt upon his courage. Pardieu, monsieur, said Athos, that's a proposition that pleases me. Not that I can accept it, but a league off it savors of the gentleman. Thus spoke and acted the gallant knights of the time of Charlemagne, in whom every cavalier ought to seek his model. Unfortunately, we do not live in the times of the great emperor. We live in the times of the cardinal. And 3 days hence, however, the secret might be guarded. It would be known, I say, that we were to fight, and our combat would be prevented. I think these fellows will never come. You are in haste, monsieur, said D'Artagnan, with the same simplicity with which a moment before he had proposed to him to be put off the duel for 3 days. And if it be your will to dispatch me at once, do not inconvenience yourself, I pray you. There is another word which pleases me, cried Athos, with a gracious nod to D'Artagnan. That did not come from a man without his heart. Monsieur, I love men of your kidney, and I foresee plenty that if we don't kill each other, I shall hereafter have much pleasure in your conversation. We will wait for these gentlemen, so please you. I have plenty of time, and it will be more correct. Ah, here is one of them, I believe. In fact, at the end of the Rue Vainqueur, the gigantic Porthos appeared. I should have seen this coming. Oh, man. What? Cried D'Artagnan. Is your first witness Monsieur Porthos? Yes, that disturbs you? By no means. And here is the second. D'Artagnan turned in the direction pointed to by Athos, and perceived Aramis. What? Cried he in an accent of greater astonishment than before. Your second witness, Monsieur Aramis? Doubtless. Are you not aware that we are never seen one without the others, and that we are called among the Musketeers and the Guards, at the court and in the city, Athos, Pathos, and Aramis? Or the 3 inseparables. And yet, as you come from from Tarbes, said D'Artagnan, it is probable you are ignorant of this little fact, said Athos. My faith, replied D'Artagnan, you are well named, gentlemen, and my adventure, if it should make any noise, will prove at least that your union is not founded upon contrasts. In the meantime, Porthos had come up, waved his hand to Athos, and then, turning toward D'Artagnan, stood quite astonished. Let us say in passing that he had changed his baldric and relinquished his cloak. Ah, said he, what does this mean? This is the gentleman I am going to fight with, said Athos, pointing to D'Artagnan with his hand and saluting him with the same gesture. Why, it is with him I am also going to fight, said Porthos. But not before 1 o'clock, replied D'Artagnan. And I also am to fight with this gentleman, said Aramis, coming in his turn and to the place. But not until 2 o'clock, said D'Artagnan, with the same calmness. But what are you going to fight about, Athos? Asked Aramis. Faith, I don't very well know. He hurt my shoulder. And you, Porthos? Faith, I am going to fight because I am going to fight, answered Porthos, reddening. Athos, whose keen eye lost nothing, perceived a faintly sly smile pass over the lips of the young Gascon as he replied, We had a short discussion upon dress. And you, Aramis? Asked Athos. Oh, ours is a theological quarrel, replied Aramis, making a sign to D'Artagnan to keep secret the cause of their duel. Athos indeed saw a second smile on the lips of D'Artagnan. Indeed, said Athos. Yes, a passage of St. Augustine upon which we could not agree, said the Gascon. Decidedly, this is a clever fellow, murmured Athos. And now you are assembled, gentlemen, said D'Artagnan. Permit me to offer you my apologies. At this word, apologies, a cloud passed over the brow of Athos. A haughty smile curled the lip of Porthos, and a negative sign was the reply of Aramis. You do not understand me, gentlemen, said D'Artagnan, throwing up his head, the sharp and bold lines of which were at the moment gilded by a bright ray of the sun. I asked to be excused in case I should not be able to discharge my debt to all 3, For Monsieur Athos has the right to kill me first, which must much diminish the face value of your bill, Monsieur Porthos, and render yours almost null, Monsieur Aramis. And now, gentlemen, I repeat, excuse me, but on that account only, and on guard!" At these words, with the most gallant air possible, D'Artagnan drew his sword. The blood had mounted to the head of D'Artagnan, and at that moment he would have drawn his sword against all the Musketeers in the kingdom as willingly as now did against Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. It was a quarter past midday, the sun was at its zenith, and the spot chosen for the scene of the duel was exposed to its full ardor. "It is very hot," said Athos, drawing his sword in its turn, "and yet I cannot take off my doublet, for just now I felt my wound begin to bleed again, and I should not like to annoy Monsieur with the sight of blood which he has not drawn from me himself." "That is true, Monsieur," replied D'Artagnan, "and whether drawn by myself or another, I assure you I shall always view with regret the blood of so brave a gentleman. I will therefore fight in my doublet like yourself." "Come, come, enough of such compliments," cried Porthos. "Remember, we are waiting for our turns." "Speak for yourself when you are inclined to utter such incongruities," interrupted Aramis. "For my part, I think what they say is very well said, and quite worthy of two gentlemen." "When you please, monsieur," said Athos, putting himself on guard. "I waited your orders," said D'Artagnan, crossing swords. But scarcely had the two rapiers clashed when a company of the guards of his eminence, commanded by Monsieur de Jussac, turned the corner of the convent. "The cardinal's guards," replied Aramis and Porthos at the same time. "Sheathe your swords, gentlemen, sheathe your swords!" But it was too late. The two combatants had been seen in a position which left no doubt of their intentions. "Halloo!" cried Jussac, advancing toward them and making sign to his men to do so likewise. "Halloo, Musketeers! Fighting here, are you? And the edicts, what has become of them?" "You are very generous, gentlemen of the guards," said Athos, full of rancor, for Jussac was one of the aggressors of the preceding days. "If we were to see you fighting, I can assure you that we would make no effort to prevent you. Leave us alone, then, and you will enjoy a little amusement without cost to yourselves." "Gentlemen," said Jussac, "it is with great regret that I pronounce the thing impossible. Duty before everything. Sheath, then, if you please, and follow us." "Monsieur," said Aramis, parodying Jussac, "it would afford us great pleasure to obey your polite invitation if it depended upon ourselves, but unfortunately the thing is impossible. Monsieur de Tréville has forbidden it. Pass on your way, then. It is the best thing to do." This raillery exasperated Jussac. "We will charge upon you, then," said he, "if you disobey." "There are 5 of them," said Athos half aloud. "There are but 3. 4. We shall be beaten again, and must die on the spot, for, on my part, I declare I will never appear again before the captain as a conquered man." Athos, Porthos, and Aramis instantly drew near one another, while Jussac drew upon his soldiers. This short interval was sufficient to determine D'Artagnan on the part he was to take. It was one of those events which decide the life of a man. It was a choice between the king and the cardinal. The choice made, it must be persisted in. To fight, that is, to disobey the law, that was the risk his head, that was to make at one blow an enemy of a minister more powerful than the king himself. All this the young man perceived, and yet, to his praise we speak it, he did not hesitate a second. Turning towards Athos and his friends, "Gentlemen," said he, "allow me to correct your words, if you please. You said you were but 3, but it appears to me we are 4. "You are not one of us," said Porthos. "That's true," replied D'Artagnan. "I have not the uniform, but I have the spirit. My heart is that of a musketeer. I feel it, monsieur, and that impels me on." "Withdraw, young man!" cried Jussac, who, doubtless by his gestures and that expression of his countenance, had guessed D'Artagnan's design. "You may retire. We consent to that. Save your skin! Be gone quickly!" D'Artagnan did not budge. "Decidedly, you are a brave fellow," said Athos, pressing the young man's hand. "Come, come, choose your part," replied Jussac. "Well," said Porthos to Aramis, "we must do something." "Monsieur is full of generosity," said Athos, but all 3 reflected upon the youth of D'Artagnan and dreaded his inexperience. "We should only be 3, one of whom is wounded, with the addition of a boy," resumed Athos, "and yet it will not be the less said we were 4 men. Yes, but to yield, said Porthos. That is difficult, replied Athos. D'Artagnan comprehended their irresolution. Try me, gentlemen, said he, and I will swear to you by my honor that I will not go hence if we are conquered. What is your name, my brave fellow? Said Athos. D'Artagnan, monsieur. Well then, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, D'Artagnan, forward! Cried Athos. Come, gentlemen, have you decided? Cried Jussac for the third time. It is done, gentlemen, said Athos. And what is your choice? Asked Jussac. We are about to have the honor of charging you, replied Aramis, lifting his hat with one hand and drawing his sword with the other. Ah, you resist, do you? Cried Jussac. Splud, does that astonish you? And the 9 combatants rushed upon each other with a fury which, however, did not exclude a certain degree of method. Athos fixed upon a certain Cahusac, a favorite of the cardinals. Porthos had Bicarat, and Aramis found himself opposed to 2 adversaries. As to D'Artagnan, he sprang toward Jussac himself. The heart of the young Gascon beat as if it would burst to his side, not from fear, God be thanked, he had not the shade of it, but with emulation. He fought like a furious tiger, turning 10 times round his adversary, and changing his ground and his guard 20 times. Jussac was, as was then said, a fine blade, and had had much practice. Nevertheless, it required all his skill to defend himself against an adversary who, active and energetic, departed every instant from received rules, attacking him on all sides at once, and yet parrying, like a man who had the greatest respect for his own epidermis. This contest at length exhausted Jussac's patience. Furious at being held in check by one whom he had considered a boy, he became warm and began to make mistakes. D'Artagnan, who, though wanting in practice, had a sound theory, redoubled his agility. Jussac, anxious to put an end to this, springing forward, aimed a terrible thrust at his adversary, but the latter parried it, and, while Jussac was recovering himself, gilded like a serpent beneath his blade, and passed his sword through his body. Jussac fell like a dead mass. D'Artagnan then cast an anxious and rapid glance over the kind field of battle. Aramis had killed one of his adversaries, but the other pressed him warmly. Nevertheless, Aramis was in a good situation and able to defend himself. Bicarat and Porthos had just made counter-hits. Porthos had received a thrust through his arm, and Bicarat one through his thigh, but neither of these 2 wounds was serious, and they only fought more earnestly. Athos, wounded anew by Cahusac, became evidently paler, but did not give way a foot. He only changed his sword hand and fought with his left hand. According to the laws of dueling at that period, D'Artagnan was at liberty to assist whom he pleased, while he was endeavoring to find out which of his companions stood in greatest need. He caught a glance from Athos. The glance was of sublime eloquence. Athos would have died rather than appeal for help, but he could look, and with that look, ask assistance. D'Artagnan interpreted it. With a terrible bound, he sprang to the side of Cahusac, crying, "To me, monsieur guardsman, I will slay you!" Cahusac turned. It was time, for Athos, whose great courage alone supported him, sank upon his knee. "Splud!" cried he to D'Artagnan, "do not kill him, young man. I beg of you. I have an old affair to settle with him, and when I am cured, and sound again. Disarm him only. Make sure of his sword. That's it. Very well done!" And the exclamation was drawn from Athos by seeing the sword of Cahusac fly 20 paces from him. D'Artagnan and Cahusac sprang forward at the same instant, the one to recover, the other to obtain the sword, but D'Artagnan, being the more active, reached it first and placed his foot upon it. Cahusac immediately ran to the guardsman whom Aramis had killed, seized his rapier, and returned toward D'Artagnan, but on his way he met Athos, who, during his relief which D'Artagnan had procured him, had recovered his breath, and who, for fear that D'Artagnan would kill his enemy, wished to resume the fight. D'Artagnan perceived that it would be disobliging Athos not to leave him alone, and in a few minutes Cahusac fell with a sword thrust in his throat. That same instant Aramis placed his sword point on the breast of his fallen enemy and forced him to ask for mercy. There only then remained Porthos and Bicarat. Porthos had made 1,000 flourishes, asking Bicarat what o'clock it would be, and offering him his compliments upon his brother's having just obtained a company in the regiment of Navarre. But, just as he might, he gained nothing. Bicarat was one of those iron men who never fell dead. Nevertheless, it was necessary to finish. The watch might come up and take all the combatants, wounded or not, royalists or cardinalists. Athos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan surrounded Bicarat and required him to surrender. Though alone against all, and with a wound in his thigh, Bicarat wished to hold out, but Jussac, who had risen upon his elbow, cried out to him to yield. Bicarat was a Gascon, as D'Artagnan was. He turned a deaf ear, and contented himself with laughing, and between two parries finding time to point to a spot of earth with his sword. "Here," cried he, parodying a verse of the Bible, "here will Bicarat die, for only am left, and they seek my life. There are 4 against you. Leave off, I command you." "Ah, if you command me, that's another thing," said Bicarat. "As you are my commander, it is my duty to obey." And springing backward, he broke his sword across his knee to avoid the necessity of surrendering it, threw the pieces over the convent wall, and crossed his arms, whistling cardinalist air. Bravery is always respected, even in an enemy. The Musketeers saluted Bicarat with their swords, and returned to them their sheaths. D'Artagnan did the same. Then, assisted by Bicarat, the only one left standing, he bore Jussac, Cahusac, and one of Aramis's adversaries, who was only wounded under the porch of the convent. The 4th, as we have said, was dead. They rang the bell, and carrying away 4 swords out of 5, they took their road, intoxicated with joy, toward the hotel of Monsieur de Treville. They walked arm in arm, occupying the whole width of the street, and taking in every musketeer they met, so that in the end it became a triumphal march. The heart of D'Artagnan swam in delirium. He marched between Athos and Porthos, pressing them tenderly. "If I am not yet a musketeer," said he to his new friends, as he passed through the gateway of Monsieur de Treville's hotel, "at least I have entered upon my apprenticeship. Haven't I?" Chapter 6. His Majesty King Louis XIII. This affair made a great noise. Monsieur de Treville scolded his musketeers in public, and congratulated them in private. But as no time was to be lost in gaining the king, Monsieur de Treville hastened to report himself at the Louvre. It was already too late. The king was closeted with the cardinal, and Monsieur de Treville was informed that the king was busy and could not receive him at the moment. At the evening, Monsieur de Treville attended the king's gaming table. The king was winning, and as he was very avaricious, he was in an excellent humor. Perceiving Monsieur de Treville at a distance, "Come here, Monsieur Captain," said he. "Come here that I may growl at you. Do you know that His Eminence has been making fresh complaints against your musketeers, and that with so much emotion that this evening His Eminence is indisposed? These musketeers of yours are very devils, fellows to be hanged." "No, sire," replied Treville, who saw at the first glance how things would go. "On the contrary, they are good creatures, as meek as lambs, and have but one desire. I'll be their warranty, and that is that their swords may never leave their scabbards but in your Majesty's service." "But what are they to do? The guards of Monsieur the Cardinal are forever seeking quarrels with them, and for the honor of the court even, the poor young men are obliged to defend themselves." "Listen to Monsieur de Treville," said the king. "Listen to him. Would not one say that he is speaking of a religious community? In truth, my dear captain, I have a great mind to take away your commission, and give it to Mademoiselle de Chimerault, to whom I promised an abbey. But don't fancy that I am going to take you on your bare word. I am called Louis the Just, Monsieur de Treville, and by and by we will see." "Ah, sire, it is because I confide in that justice that I shall wait patiently and quietly the good pleasure of your Majesty." "Wait, then, monsieur, wait, and the king," said the king, "I will not detain you long." In fact, fortune changed. As the king began to lose what he had won, he was not sorry to find an excuse for playing Charlemagne, if we may use a gaming phrase of whose origin we confess our ignorance. The king, therefore, arose a minute after, and putting the money which lay before him into his pocket, the major part of which arose from his winnings, "La Vieuville," said he, "take my place. I must speak to Monsieur de Treville on an affair of importance. I had 80 louis before me. Put down the same sum, so that they who have lost may have nothing to complain of. Justice before everything." Then, turning toward Monsieur de Treville, and walking with him toward the embrasure of a window, "Well, monsieur," continued he, "you say it is His Eminence's guards who have sought a quarrel with your musketeers?" "Yes, sir, as they always do." "And how did the things happen? Let us see. For you know, my dear captain, a judge must hear both sides." Good Lord, in the most simple and natural manner possible, 3 of my best soldiers, whom your majesty knows by name, and whose devotedness you have more than once appreciated, and who have, I dare affirm to the king, his service much at heart. 3 of my best soldiers, I say, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, had made a party of pleasure with a young fellow from Gascony, whom I had introduced to them the same morning. The party was to take place at Saint Germain, I believe, and they had appointed to meet at the Carmin-sur-Saulx, and when they were disturbed by Jussac, Cahusac, Beccaret, and 2 other guardsmen, who certainly did not go there in such a numerous company without some ill intention against the edicts. Ah, you incline me to think so, said the king. There is no doubt they went thither to fight themselves. I do not accuse them, sire, but I leave your majesty to judge what 5 armed men could possibly be going to do in such a deserted place as the neighborhood of the Convent des Champs. Yes, you are right, Treville. You are right. Then, upon seeing my musketeers, they changed their minds and forgot their private hatred for partisan hatred. For your majesty cannot be ignorant that the musketeers who belong to the king, and nobody but the king, are the natural enemies of the guardsmen who belong to the cardinal. Yes, Treville, yes, said the king in a melancholy tone, and it is very sad, believe me, to see thus 2 parties in France, 2 heads to royalty. But all this will come to an end, Treville, will come to an end. You say, then, that the guardsmen sought a quarrel with the musketeers? I say that it is probable that things have fallen out so, but I will not swear to it, sire. You know how difficult it is to discover the truth, and unless a man be endowed with that admirable instinct which causes Louis XIII to be named the Just, you are right, Treville. But they were not alone, your musketeers. They had a youth with them. Yes, sire, and 1 wounded man, so that 3 of the king's musketeers, 1 of whom was wounded, and a youth not only maintained their ground against 5 of the most terrible of the cardinal's guardsmen, but absolutely brought 4 of them to the earth. Why, this is a victory, cried the king, all radiant. A complete victory. Yes, sire, as complete as that of the bridge of Say. 4 men, 1 of them wounded, and a youth, you say you? One hardly a man, but who, however, behaved himself so admirably on this occasion that I will take the liberty of recommending him to your majesty. How does he call himself? D'Artagnan, sire. He is the son of one of my oldest friends, the son of a man who served under the king your father, of glorious memory, in the Civil War. And you say this young man behaves himself well? Tell me how, Treville. You know how I delight in accounts of war and fighting. And Louis XIII twisted his mustache proudly, placing his hand upon his hip. Sire, resumed Treville, as I told you, Monsieur d'Artagnan is little more than a boy, and as he has not the honor of being a musketeer, he was dressed as a citizen. The guards of the cardinal, perceiving his youth and that he did not belong to the court, invited him to retire before they attacked. So you may plainly see, Treville, interrupted the king. It was they who attacked? That is true, sire. There can be no more doubt on that head. They called upon him then to retire, but he answered that he was a musketeer at heart, entirely devoted to your majesty, and that therefore he would remain with messieurs the musketeers. Brave young man, murmured the king. Well, he did remain with them, and your majesty has in him so firm a champion that it was he who gave Jussac the terrible sword thrust which has made the cardinal so angry. He who wounded Jussac, cried the king. He a boy. Treville, that's impossible. It is, as I have the honor to relate it to you. Jussac, one of the first swordsmen in the kingdom? Well, sire, for once he found his master. I will see this young man, Treville. I will see him, and if anything can be done, well, we will make it our business. When will your majesty deign to receive him? Tomorrow at midday, Treville. Shall I bring him alone? No, bring me all 4 together. I wish to thank them all at once. Devoted men are so rare, Treville. By the back staircase. It is useless to let the cardinal know. Yes, sire. You understand, Treville, an edict is still an edict. It is forbidden to fight, after all. But this encounter, sire, is quite out of the ordinary conditions of a duel. It is a brawl. The proof is that there were 5 of the cardinal's guardsmen against my 3 musketeers, and Monsieur d'Artagnan. That is true, said the king. But never mind, Treville. Come still by the back staircase. Treville smiled, but as it was indeed something that had prevailed upon this child to rebel against his master, he saluted the king respectfully, and with this agreement took leave of him. That evening the three musketeers were informed of the honor accorded them. As they had long been acquainted with the king, they were not much excited, but D'Artagnan, with his Gascon imagination, saw in it his future fortune, and passed by the night in golden dreams. By 8 o'clock in the morning he was at the apartment of Athos. D'Artagnan found the musketeer dressed and ready to go out, as the hour to wait upon the king was not till 12. He had made a party with Porthos and Aramis to play a game of tennis in a tennis court situated near the stables of the Luxembourg. Athos invited D'Artagnan to follow them, and although ignorant of the game, which he had never played, he accepted, not knowing what to do with his time from 9 o'clock in the morning, as then scarcely was till 12. The two musketeers were already there and were playing together. Athos was very expert in all bodily exercises, passed with D'Artagnan to the opposite side and challenged him. But at the first effort he made, although he played with his left hand, he found that his wound was yet too recent to allow of such exertion. D'Artagnan remained, therefore, alone, and as he declared he was too ignorant of the game to play it regularly, they could only continue giving balls to one another without counting. But one of these balls, launched by Porthos's Herculean hand, passed so close to D'Artagnan's face, and he thought that if, instead of passing near, it had hit him, his audience would have been probably lost, as it would have been impossible for him to present himself before the king. Now, as upon this audience, in his Gascon imagination, depended his future life. He saluted Aramis and Porthos politely, declaring that he would not resume the game until he should be prepared to play with them on more equal terms, and went and took his place near the court and in the gallery. Unfortunately for D'Artagnan, among the spectators, one of his Eminence's guardsmen, who, still irritated by the defeat of his companions, which had happened only the day before, he promised himself to seize the first opportunity of avenging it. He believed this opportunity was now come, and addressed his neighbor. It is not astonishing that the young man should be afraid of the ball, for he is doubtless a musketeer apprentice. D'Artagnan turned round as if a serpent had stung him, and fixed his eyes intensely upon the guardsman who had just made this insolent speech. Pardon, resumed the latter, twisting his moustache. Look at me as long as you like, my gentleman. I have said what I have said. And since that which you have said is too clear to require any explanation, replied D'Artagnan in a low voice, I beg you to follow me. And when? Asked the guardsman, with the same jeering air. At once, if you please. And you know who I am, without doubt. I am completely ignorant, nor does it much disquiet me. You're in the wrong there, for if you knew my name, perhaps you would not be so pressing. What is your name? Bernajoux, at your service. Well then, Monsieur Bernajoux, said D'Artagnan tranquilly, I will wait for you at the door. Go, monsieur. I will follow you. Do not hurry yourself, monsieur, lest it be observed that we go out together. You must be aware that for our undertaking, company would be in the way. That's true, said the guardsman, astonished that his name had not produced more effect upon the young man. Indeed, the name Bernajoux was well known to all the world, D'Artagnan alone excepted, perhaps, for it was one of those which figured most frequently in the daily brawls which all the edicts of the cardinal could not repress. Porthos and Aramis were so engaged with their game, and Athos was watching them with so much attention, that they did not even perceive their young companion go out, who, as he had told the guardsman of his eminence, stopped outside the door. An instant after, the guardsman descended in his turn. As D'Artagnan had no time to lose on account of the audience of the king, which was fixedly for midday, he cast his eyes round, and seeing that the street was empty, said to his adversary, My faith, it is fortunate for you, although your name is Bernajoux, to have only to deal with an apprentice musketeer. Never mind, be content, I will do my best. On guard! But, said he whom D'Artagnan thus provoked, it appears to me that this place is badly chosen, and that we should be better behind the Abbey Street Saint-Germain, or in the Pré aux Clercs. What you say is full of sense, replied D'Artagnan, but unfortunately I have very little time to spare, having an appointment at 12 precisely. On guard then, monsieur, on guard! Bernajoux was not a man to have such a compliment paid to him twice. In an instant his sword glittered in his hand, and he sprang upon his adversary, whom, thanks to his great youthfulness, he hoped to intimidate. But D'Artagnan had one of the preceding days served his apprenticeship. Fresh sharpened by his victory, full of hopes of future favor, he was resolved not to recoil a step. So the two swords were crossed close to the hilts, and as D'Artagnan stood firm, it was his adversary who made the retreating step. But D'Artagnan seized the moment at which, in this movement, the sword of Bernajoux deviated from the line. He freed his weapon, made a lunge, and touched his adversary on the shoulder. D'Artagnan immediately made a step backward and raised his sword, but Bernajoux cried out that it was nothing, and rushed blindly upon him, absolutely spitted himself upon D'Artagnan's sword. As, however, he did not fall, as he did not declare himself conquered, but only broke away toward the hotel of Monsieur de la Tremouille, in whose service he had a relative, D'Artagnan was ignorant of the seriousness of the last wound his adversary had received, and pressing him warmly, without doubt, would soon have completed his work with a third blow, when, the noise which arose from the street being heard in the tennis court, two of the friends of the guardsman, who had seen him go out after the exchange of some words with D'Artagnan, rushed, sword in hand, from the court, and fell upon the conqueror. But Athos, Porthos, and Aramis quickly appeared in their turn, and the moment the two guardsmen attacked their young companion, drove them back. Bernajoux now fell, and as the guardsmen were only 2 against 4, they began to cry, "To the rescue! The Hotel de la Tremouille!" At these cries, all who were in the hotel rushed out to fall upon the 4 companions, who, on their side, cried aloud, "To the rescue, Musketeers!" This cry was generally heeded, for the Musketeers were known to be enemies of the cardinal, and were beloved on account of the hatred they bore to his eminence. Thus the soldiers of other companies than those which belonged to the Red Duke, as Aramis had called him, often took part with the king's Musketeers in these quarrels. Of three guardsmen of the company of Monsieur Desessart, were advancing. 2 came to the assistance of the 4 companions, while the other ran toward the hotel of Monsieur de Treville, crying, "To the rescue, Musketeers! To the rescue!" As usual, this hotel was full of soldiers of this company, who hastened to the succor of their comrades. The melee became general, but strength was on the side of the Musketeers. The cardinal's guards and Monsieur de la Tremouille people retreated to the hotel, the doors of which they closed just in time to prevent their enemies from entering with them. As to the wounded man, he had been taken in at once, and, as we have said, in a very bad state. Excitement was at its height among the Musketeers and their allies, and they even began to deliberate whether they should not set fire to the hotel to punish the insolence of Monsieur de la Tremouille's domestics in daring to make a sortie upon the king's Musketeers. The proposition had been made, and received with enthusiasm, when fortunately 11 o'clock struck. D'Artagnan and his companions remembered their audience, and as they would very much have regretted that such an opportunity should be lost, they succeeded in calming their friends, who contented themselves with hurling some paving stones against the gates. But the gates were too strong. They soon tired of the sport. Besides, those who must be considered the leaders of the enterprise had quit the group and were making their way toward the hotel of Monsieur de Treville, who was waiting for them, already informed of this fresh disturbance. "Quick, to the Louvre," said he, "to the Louvre, without losing an instant, and let us endeavor to see the king before he is prejudiced by the cardinal. We will describe the thing to him as a consequence of the affair of yesterday, and the 2 will pass off together." Monsieur de Treville, accompanied by the 4 young fellows, directed his course toward the Louvre, but, to the great astonishment of the captain of the Musketeers, he was informed that the king had gone stag hunting in the forest of Saint Germain. Monsieur de Treville required this intelligence to be repeated to him twice, and each time his companion saw his brow become darker. "Had his Majesty," asked he, "any intention of holding this hunting party yesterday?" "No, your Excellency," replied the valet de chambre. "The master of the hounds came this morning to inform him that he had marked down a stag. At first the king answered that he would not go, but he could not resist his love of the sport, and set out after dinner." "And the king has seen the cardinal?" asked Monsieur de Treville. "In all probability he has," replied the valet, "for I saw the horses harnessed to his eminence's carriage this morning, and when I asked where he was going, they told me to Saint Germain." "He is beforehand with us," said Monsieur de Treville. "Gentlemen, I will see the king this evening, but as to you, I do not advise you to risk doing so." This advice was too reasonable, and moreover came from a man who knew the king too well to allow the 4 young men to dispute it. Monsieur de Treville recommended everyone to return home and wait for news. On entering his hotel, Monsieur de Treville thought it best to be first in making the complaint. He sent out one of his servants to Monsieur de la Tremouille with a letter in which he begged of him to eject the cardinal's guardsmen from his house, and to reprimand his people for their audacity to making sortie against the king's musketeers. But Monsieur de la Tremouille, already prejudiced by his esquire, whose relative, as we already know, Bernajoux was, replied that it was neither for Monsieur de Treville nor the musketeers to complain, but, on the contrary, for him, whose people the musketeers had assaulted, and whose hotel they had endeavored to burn. Now, as the debate between these two nobles might last a long time, each becoming naturally more firm in his own opinion, Monsieur de Treville thought of an expedient which might terminate it quietly. This was to go to himself to Monsieur de la Tremouille. He repaired, therefore, immediately to his hotel, and caused himself to be announced. The two nobles saluted each other politely, for if no friendship existed between them, there was at least esteem. Both were men of courage and honor, and as Monsieur de la Tremouille, a Protestant, and seeing the king seldom, was of no party, he did not, in general, carry any bias into his social relations. This time, however, his address, though polite, was cooler than usual. Monsieur, said Monsieur de Treville, we fancy that we have each cause to complain of the other, and I am come to endeavor to clear up this affair. I have no objection, replied Monsieur de la Tremouille, but I warn you that I am well informed, and all the fault is with your musketeers. You are too just and reasonable a man, monsieur, said Treville, not to accept the proposal I am about to make you. Make it, monsieur, I listen. How is Monsieur Bernajoux, your esquire's relative? Why, monsieur, very ill indeed. In addition to the sword thrust in his arm, which is not dangerous, he has received another right through his lungs, of which the doctor says bad things. But has the wounded man retained his senses? Perfectly. Does he talk? With difficulty, but he can speak. Well, monsieur, let us go to him. Let us adjure him in the name of God, before whom he must perhaps appear, to speak the truth. I will take him for judge in his own cause, monsieur, and will believe what he will say. Monsieur de la Tremouille reflected for an instant. Then, as it was difficult to suggest a more reasonable proposal, he agreed to it. Both descended to the chamber in which the wounded man lay. The latter, on whose seeing these noble lords who came to visit him, endeavored to raise himself up in his bed, but he was too weak and exhausted by the effort. He fell back again, almost senseless. Monsieur de la Tremouille approached him, and made him inhale some salts, which recalled him to life. Then Monsieur de Treville, unwilling that it should be thought that he had influenced the wounded man, requested Monsieur de la Tremouille to interrogate him himself. That happened which Monsieur de Treville had foreseen. Placed between life and death, as Bernajoux was, he had no idea for a moment of concealing the truth. And he described to the two nobles the affair exactly as it had passed. This was all that Monsieur de Treville wanted. He wished Bernajoux a speedy convalescence, took leave of Monsieur de la Tremouille, returned to his hotel, and immediately sent word to the four friends that he awaited their company at dinner. Monsieur de Treville entertained good company, wholly anti-cardinalist although. It may easily be understood, therefore, that the conversation during the whole of dinner turned upon the two checks that His Eminence's guardsmen had received. Now, as D'Artagnan had been the hero of these two fights, it was upon him that all the felicitations fell, which Athos, Porthos, and Aramis abandoned to him, not only as good comrades, but as men who had so often had their turn that they could very well afford him his. Toward 6 o'clock, Monsieur de Treville announced that it was time to go to the Louvre. But, as the hour of audience granted by His Majesty was past, instead of claiming an entrée by the back stairs, he placed himself with the four young men in the antechamber. The king had not yet returned from hunting. Our young men had been waiting about half an hour amid a crowd of courtiers, when all the doors were thrown open and His Majesty was announced. At his announcement, D'Artagnan felt himself tremble to the very marrow of his bones. The coming instant would in all probability decide the rest of his life. His eyes, therefore, were fixed in a sort of agony upon the door through which the king must enter. Louis XIII appeared, walking fast. He was in hunting costume, covered with dust, wearing large boots and holding a whip in his hand. At the first glance, D'Artagnan judged that the mind of the king was stormy. This disposition, visible as it was in His Majesty, did not prevent the courtiers from ranging themselves along his pathway. In royal antechambers, it is worth more to be viewed with an angry eye than not to be seen at all. The three musketeers, therefore, did not hesitate to make a step forward. D'Artagnan, on the contrary, remained concealed behind them. But although the king knew Athos, Porthos, and Aramis personally, he passed before them without speaking or looking. Indeed, if he had never seen them before. As for Monsieur de Treville, when the eyes of the king fell upon him, he sustained the look with so much firmness that it was the king who dropped his eyes. After which his majesty, grumbling, entered his apartment. Matters go but badly, said Athos, smiling, and we shall not be made chevaliers of the order this time. Wait here 10 minutes, said Monsieur de Treville, and if at the expiration of 10 minutes you do not see me come out, return to my hotel, for it will be useless for you to wait for me any longer. The four men waited 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and seeing that Monsieur de Treville did not return, went away very uneasy as to what was going to happen. Monsieur de Treville entered the king's cabinet boldly, and found his majesty in a very ill humor, seated on an armchair, beating his boot with the handle of his whip. Thus, however, did not prevent his asking, with the greatest coolness after his majesty's health. Bad, monsieur, bad, replied the king. I am bored. This was, in fact, the worst complaint of Louis XIII, who would sometimes take one of his courtiers to a window and say, Monsieur so-and-so, let us weary ourselves together. How? Your majesty is bored? Have you not enjoyed the pleasures of the chase today? A fine pleasure indeed, monsieur. Upon my soul, everything degenerates. And I don't know whether it is the game which leaves no scent, or the dogs that have no noses. We started a stag of 10 branches. We chased him for 6 hours. And when he was near being taken, when Saint Simon was already putting his horn to his mouth to sound the mort, crack! All the pack takes the wrong scent and sets after a 2-year-older. I shall be obliged to give up hunting, as I have given up hawking. Ah, I am an unfortunate king, Monsieur de Treville. I had but one gerfalcon, and he died day before yesterday. What's up, Tyrio? Another vote for Dorian Gray. Nice. It's already winning. Indeed, sire, I wholly comprehend your disappointment. The misfortune is great, but I think you have still a good number of falcons, sparrow, hawks, and tiercells, and not a man to instruct them. Falconeers are declining. I know no one but myself who is acquainted with the noble art of venery. After me it will all be over, and people will hunt with gins, snares, and traps. I assume that's supposed to say guns, not gins. If I had but the time to train pupils, but there is the cardinal always at hand, who does not leave me a moment's repose, who talks to me about Spain, who talks to me about Austria, who talks to me about England. Ah, apropos of the cardinal, Monsieur de Treville, I am vexed with you. This was the chance at which Monsieur de Treville waited for the king. He knew the king of old, and he knew that all these complaints were but a preface, a sort of excitation to encourage himself, and that he had now come to his point at last. And in what have I been so unfortunate as to displease your majesty? Asked Monsieur de Treville, feigning the most profound astonishment. Is it thus you perform your charge, monsieur? Continued the king, without directly replying to de Treville's question. Is it for this I name you captain of my musketeers, that they should assassinate a man, disturb a whole quarter, and endeavor to set fire to Paris without your saying a word? But yet, continued the king, undoubtedly my haste accuses you wrongfully. Without doubt the rioters are in prison, and you come to tell me justice is done. Sire, replied Monsieur de Treville calmly, on the contrary, I come to demand it of you. And against whom? Cried the king. Against calumniators, said Monsieur de Treville. Ah, this is something new, replied the king. Will you tell me what your 3 damned musketeers, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, and your youngster from Béarn, have not fallen, like so many furies, upon poor Bernajoux, and have not maltreated him in such a fashion that probably by this time he is dead? Will you tell me that they did not lay siege to the hotel of Dumas, and that they endeavored to burn it, which would not perhaps have been a great misfortune in time of war, seeing that it is nothing but a nest of Huguenots? but which is, in time of peace, a frightful example? Tell me now, can you deny all this?" "And who told you this fine story, sire?" asked Tréville quietly. "Who has told me this fine story, monsieur? Who should it be but he who watches while I sleep, who labors while I amuse myself, who conducts everything at home and abroad, in France and in Europe?" "Your Majesty probably refers to God," said Monsieur de Treville, "for I know no one except God who can be so far above your Majesty." "No, monsieur, I speak of the prop of the state, of my only servant, of my only friend, of the cardinal. His eminence is not his holiness, sire." "What do you mean by that, monsieur?" "That it is only the Pope who is infallible, and that his infallibility does not extend to cardinals." "You mean to say that he deceives me? You mean to say that he betrays me? You accuse him, then? Come, speak. Avow freely that you accuse him." "No, sire, but I say that he deceives himself. I say that he is ill-informed. I say that he has hastily accused your Majesty's Musketeers, toward whom he is unjust, and that he has not obtained his information from good sources. The accusation comes from Monsieur de la Tremouille, from the Duke himself. What do you say to that?" "I might answer, sire, that he is too deeply interested in the question to be a very impartial witness. But so far from that, sire, I know the Duke to be a royal gentleman, and I refer the matter to him. But upon one condition, sire." "What?" "It is that your Majesty will make him come here, will interrogate him yourself, tete-a-tete, tete-a-tete, without witnesses, and that I shall see your Majesty as soon as you have seen the Duke." "What then? You will bind yourself," cried the king, "by what Monsieur de la Tremouille shall say?" "Yes, sire." "You will accept his judgment?" "Undoubtedly." "And you will submit to the reparation he may require?" "Certainly." "La Chesnaye," said the king. "La Chesnaye!" Louis XIII's confidential valet, who never left the door, entered in to reply the call. "La Chesnaye," said the king, "let someone go instantly and find Monsieur de la Tremouille. I wish to speak to him within this evening." "Your Majesty gives me your word that you will not see anyone between Monsieur de la Tremouille and myself?" "Nobody, by the faith of a gentleman." "Tomorrow, then, sire?" "Tomorrow, monsieur." "At what o'clock, please your Majesty?" "At any hour you will. But in coming too early I should be afraid of awakening your Majesty." "Awaken me! Do you think I ever sleep, then?" "I sleep no longer, monsieur. I sometimes dream, that's all. Come, then, as early as you like, at 7 o'clock. But beware, if you and your musketeers are guilty." "If my musketeers are guilty, sire, the guilty shall be placed in your Majesty's hands, who will dispose of them at your good pleasure. Does your Majesty require anything further? Speak, I am ready to obey." "No, monsieur, no. I am not called Louis the Just without reason. Tomorrow, then, monsieur, tomorrow. Till then, God preserve your Majesty." However ill the king might sleep, Monsieur de Treville slept still worse. He had ordered his 3 musketeers and their companion to be with him at 6:30 in the morning. He took them with him, without encouraging them or promising them anything, and without concealing from them that their luck, and even his own, depend upon the cast of the dice. Arrived at the foot of the back stairs, he desired them to wait. If the king was still irritated against them, they would depart without being seen. If the king consented to see them, they would only have to be called. On arriving at the king's private antechamber, Monsieur de Treville found La Chesnaye, who informed him that they had not been able to find Monsieur de la Tremouille on the preceding evening at his hotel, that he returned too late to present himself at the Louvre, and he had only that moment arrived, and that he was at the very hour with the king. This circumstance pleased Monsieur de Treville much, as he thus became certain that no foreign suggestion could insinuate itself between Monsieur de la Tremouille's testimony and himself. In fact, 10 minutes had scarcely passed away when the door of the king's closet opened, and Monsieur de Treville saw Monsieur de Tremouille come out. The king came straight up to him and said, "Monsieur de Treville, His Majesty has just sent for me in order to inquire respecting the circumstances which took place yesterday at my hotel. I have told him the truth, that is to say, that the fault lay with my people, and that I was ready to offer you my excuses. Since I have the good fortune to meet you, I beg you to receive them, and to hold me always as one of your friends." "Monsieur the Duke," said Monsieur de Treville, "I was so confident of your loyalty that I required no other defender before his Majesty than yourself. I find that I have not been mistaken, and I thank you that there is still one man in France of whom may be said, without disappointment, what I have said of you." "That's well said," cried the king, who heard all these compliments through the door. "Only tell him, Tréville, since he wishes to be considered your friend, that I also wish to be one of his. But he neglects me. That is nearly 3 years since I have seen him, and that I never do see him unless I send for him. Tell him all this for me, for these are things which a king cannot say for himself." "Thanks, sire," said the duke, "but your majesty may be assured that it is not those. I do not speak of Monsieur de Treville, whom your majesty sees at all hours of the day, that are most devoted to you." "Ah! You have heard what I said. So much better, the duke, so much the better," said the king, advancing toward the door. "Ah, it is you, Treville. Where are your musketeers? I told you the day before yesterday to bring them with you. Why have you not done so?" "They are below, sire, and, with your permission, La Chesnaye will bid them come up." "Yes, yes, let them come up immediately. It is nearly 8 o'clock, and at 9 I expect a visit. Go, Monsieur Duke, and return often. Come in, Treville." The duke saluted and retired. At the moment he opened the door, and 3 musketeers and D'Artagnan, conducted by La Chesnaye, appeared at the top of the staircase. "Come in, my braves," said the king. "Come in. I am going to scold you." The musketeers advanced, bowing, D'Artagnan following closely behind them. "What the devil!" continued the king. "7 of his eminence's guards placed hors de combat by you 4 in 2 days. That's too many, gentlemen, too many. If you go on so, his eminence will be forced to renew his company in 3 weeks, and I put the edicts in force in all their rigor. One now and then I don't say much about, but 7 in 2 days, I repeat, it is too many. It is far too many. Therefore, sire, your majesty sees that they are come, quite contrite and repentant, to offer you their excuses." "Quite contrite and repentant," said the king. "I place no confidence in their hypocritical faces. In particular is one yonder of a Gascon look. Come hither, monsieur." D'Artagnan, who understood that it was him this compliment was addressed, approached, assuming a most deprecating air. "Why, you told me he was a young man. This boy, Treville, a mere boy. Do you mean to say that it was he who bestowed that severe thrust at Jussac? And those 2 equally fine thrusts at Bernajoux? Truly!" "Without reckoning," said Athos, "that if he had not rescued me from the hands of Cahusac, I should not now have the honor of making my very humble reverence to your majesty." "Why, he is a very devil, this Béarnais. Vengeance Saint-Gre, Monsieur de Treville, as the king my father would have said. But at this sort of work, many doublets must be slashed and many swords broken. Now, Gascons are always poor, are they not?" "Sire, I can assert that they have hitherto discovered no gold mines in their mountains, though the Lord owes them this miracle in recompense for the manner in which they supported the pretensions of the king of your father." "Which is to say that the Gascons made a king of me, myself, saying that I am my father's son, is it not, Treville?" "Well, happily, I don't say nay to it. La Chesnaye, go and see if by rummaging all my pockets you can find 40 pistols, and if you can find them, bring them to me. And now let us see, young man, with your hand upon your conscience, how did all this come to pass?" D'Artagnan related the adventure of the preceding day in all its details, how, not having been able to sleep for the joy he felt in the expectation of seeing his majesty, he had gone to his 3 friends 3 hours before the hour of audience, how they had gone together to the tennis court, and how upon the fear he had manifested lest he received a ball in the face, he had been jeered at by Bernajoux, who had nearly paid for his jeer with his life, and Monsieur de la Tremouille, who had nothing to do with the matter, with the loss of his hotel. "This is all very well," murmured the king. "Yes, this is just the account of the duke gave me of the affair. Poor cardinal. 7 men in 2 days, and those of his very best. But that's quite enough, gentlemen. Please to understand, that's enough. You have taken your revenge for the Rue Ferreux, and even exceeded it. You ought to be satisfied." "If your majesty is so," said Tréville, "we are." "Oh, yes, I am," added the king, taking a handful of gold from La Chesnaye and putting it into the hand of D'Artagnan. "Here," said he, "is proof of my satisfaction." At this epoch the ideas of pride, which are in fashion in our days, did not prevail. A gentleman received from hand to hand money from the king, and was not the least in the world humiliated. D'Artagnan put his 40 pistols into his pocket without any scruple, on the contrary, thanking his majesty greatly. "There," said the king, looking at a clock, There, now, as if it has past 8, you may retire, for as I told you, I expect someone at 9. Thanks for your devotedness, gentlemen. I may continue to rely upon it, may I not? Oh, sire, cried the four companions with one voice, we will not allow ourselves to be cut to pieces in your majesty's service. Well, well, but keep whole, that will be better, and you will be more useful to me. Treville, added the king in a low voice as the others were retiring, as you have no room in the Musketeers, and as we have besides decided that a novice is necessary before entering the corps, place this young man in the company of the guards of Monsieur Dessessart, your brother-in-law. Ah, pardieu, Treville. I enjoy beforehand the face the cardinal will make. He will be furious. But I don't care. I am doing what is right. The king waved his hand to Treville, who left him and rejoined the musketeers, whom he found sharing the 40 pistols with D'Artagnan. The cardinal, as his majesty had said, was really furious, so furious that during 8 days he absented himself from the king's gaming table. Himself from the king's gaming table. This did not prevent the king from being as complacent to him as possible. Whenever he met him, or from asking in the kindest tone, "Well, Monsieur Cardinal, how fares it with that poor Jussac and the poor Bernajoux of yours?"